It's February 7th, 1992, and the foundation of the European Union has just been laid. The 12 founding members met in the Netherlands to sign the Maastricht Treaty and, after years of negotiation, finalized the creation of a new world superpower. Superpower which was supposed to unite the most advanced countries in Europe, proving that even nations that fought, hated, and killed each other not so long ago can turn a new page and work together to make Europe and the world better. But not everyone, even within these soon-to-be member states, was happy about the new union. Only 3 months after the Maastricht Treaty was signed, Margaret Thatcher, the longest-serving British Prime Minister of the 20th century, said in her speech on the future of Europe, quote, "A half Europe imposed by Soviet tyranny was one thing. A half Europe imposed by Brussels would be a moral catastrophe depriving the community of its European legitimacy. The Commission knows it will have to admit new members in the next few decades, but it hopes to construct a centralized European superstate in advance and irrevocably so that the new members will have to apply for entry on federalist terms. This is not so much constructing a common European home as a common European prison. And it's just not on. Imagine a European community of 30 nations, ranging in their economic productivity from Germany to Ukraine, and in their political stability from Britain to Poland. All governed from Brussels, all enforcing the same conditions at work, all having the same worker rights as the German unions, all subject to the same interest rates, monetary, fiscal, and economic policies, all agreeing on a common foreign and defense policy, and all accepting the authority of an executive and a remote foreign parliament over 80% of economic and social legislation. Such a body is an even more utopian enterprise than the Tower of Babel, for at least the builders of Babel all spoke the same language when they began. My name is Milan, and here is why I think that the European Union might be the next empire to collapse. First of all, by collapse I don't necessarily mean complete dissolution. At least not in my lifetime. I'm 25 now. I think that's a realistic scenario too, but here I'm talking more about the declining influence of the European Union, especially compared to other world superpowers. I think that the European Union is now facing both external and internal challenges which will put its influence, prosperity, and survival into question over the upcoming years and decades. I'll describe what these are, but let me give you some context first. I was born in Slovakia, which is a small country of 5.5 million people in the middle of Europe. For much of their history, the Slovak people were not free, but rather under the control of someone more powerful. 1500 years ago, it was the Huns, then the Kingdom of Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and in more recent times, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, and even the Czechs to some extent during the 20th century. It was only in 1993 that Slovakia became independent, and 11 years later, in 2004, Slovakia joined the European Union. Independent Slovaks on the path to close integration with the Western world. That's amazing, right? well, maybe it's amazing, but it's only true from a limited point of view. Because if you look at all the parliamentary elections which Slovakia has held since becoming independent in 1993, only 4 out of 10 times was the government formed by less populist, more anti-corruption and very strongly pro-Western parties. And only once did a party like this get the most votes. This happened in 2020. So why has this been the case? First of all, I believe that centuries of oppression have fundamentally shaped how many Slovaks think about politics and the world. Slovakia, in terms of voters, is divided into multiple bubbles and sub-bubbles, which is normal. That's the case everywhere. What's interesting is that here, people in these bubbles don't always align with a specific party or a specific leader. Slovakia has a multi-party systems, but it's very interesting because sometimes people within the same bubble vote for parties on the opposite ends of the political spectrum. For example, not all conservative Christians in the Slovak countryside vote the same. Out of all the voter bubbles in Slovakia, 2 are the biggest and definitely the loudest. Many people in the first bubble, let's call it bubble A, personally experienced political repression, primarily by the Soviet Union, but this goes back in most Slovak families, not only in bubble A, for generations, so hundreds, even thousands of years. These people had to learn how to survive oppression. Now, some of them made it by collaborating with the regimes, some fought against the regimes, but most of them, I think that made it simply by keeping their heads down, and they did whatever was necessary, but not more. On top of keeping their heads down, these people also learned to not trust others. Especially the elites, so rich people, politicians, etc. But they also learned to not trust strangers and sometimes even their neighbors, because you never knew who might be collaborating with STB, the secret police in communist Czechoslovakia, and might be planning to turn you in for planning an escape from the country. If you don't trust others and you are automatically suspicious of strangers, your neighbors, and of course the elites, it's very simple to start blaming these people for problems, including your own. And that's what people in Bubble A started doing. They started to see, especially the elites, as the cause of all evil in the world, sometimes also as the cause of them not doing great in life. And honestly, Bubble A kind of has a good reason to believe this, because for a long time, those in power were actually making the lives of average Slovaks miserable. One of the interesting outcomes of this evolution has been that over the centuries, Slovaks became really good at survival. Again, they had to learn how to survive political systems that were trying to kill them psychologically, but sometimes physically as well. Now, if you care primarily about survival, you will not care about things like progress or growth. And that's how bubble A is in Slovakia, even today, even though it's been decades after the Soviet communism ended in Slovakia. Many people in bubble A, they just want to survive. They don't really care, as I said, about progress or growth. And if you focus primarily on survival, one of the things that you are going to hate the most is change. Change threatens your ability to survive. This explains why people in bubble A don't like things that are new or unknown, especially when they come from a foreign country. Because when something new or unknown came from a foreign country, it often meant that the lives of average Slovaks became even worse. Knowing this, it's not a surprise that bubble A is not crazy about the European Union either. The European Union is constantly trying to change them by telling them how they should live and what they should think. Of course, and on top of that, when people in bubble A look at the leaders of the European Union, they see a bunch of people who are completely different from them. As you might expect, most people in bubble A, they live in the countryside, they don't travel too much, they don't speak many languages. So when they look at the leaders of the European Union, they see people who they don't even speak the same language, yet they are trying to tell them how they should live and what their beliefs should be. Of course, bubble A is going to hate this and will fight against this. This also explains why bubble A votes the way it does. To them, it's not really important how good or bad the candidate actually is. What they've done, they could just as well be a dictator. Bubble A will support them as long as the candidate promises to protect the bubble, to not try to change them and their lives. And it's even better if the candidate promises to fight against anyone or anything that threatens bubble A. So will bubble A ever change? I don't think so. There is this scene in the Shawshank Redemption. I'm sorry to anyone who hasn't seen the movie for spoiler, but I think most of you have. So there is this scene in the Shawshank Redemption where Brooks, that's the old guy, the old prisoner who works in the library, when he finds out that he will be released from Shawshank after 50 years, he tries to kill another prisoner just so he can stay. His friends convince him not to do it, but after Brooks is released, he's not able to adjust to the new life and to the changes that happened to the world while he was in prison. He tries, he gets a job, etc. But at the end, he wasn't able to do it, and shortly after getting released, Brooks hangs himself. The term they use in the movie to describe what happened to Brooks is institutionalization. After 50 years in prison, Brooks had been institutionalized. Just like bubble A in Slovakia, after hundreds of years in political prisons, has also been institutionalized. And that's why I don't think that they will ever change. I would say that 20 to 30% of voters in Slovakia right now are deep in bubble A, with an additional 20 to 30% on the periphery. The people on the periphery are open to some change, but I think that many of them decide whether to vote, and if yes, who to vote for based on the other side. If they feel really threatened by the enemy, they'll just unite with deep bubble A, and because of the combined size, bubble A often wins. Now, let's go to the second bubble. While bubble A hates change, the second biggest bubble, let's call it bubble B, wants to change everything. Bubble B doesn't like things that are too old or too traditional or too mainstream, even though they have kind of themselves become the mainstream over the past couple of years, especially among young people, but also teachers, artists, etc. Even though bubble A and bubble B obviously hate each other and they are completely different on the outside, on the inside they are pretty much the same. Just like bubble A, bubble B also lives in its own version of Shawshank. While bubble A identifies itself as Christian, even though I would not bet on all of them, actually many of them are acting as good Christians in their private lives, but who am I to judge? I have no right to judge them, but they do claim to be Christians. They present themselves as Christians. On the other side, bubble B has people of all religions and spiritualities. Many people in bubble B claim to be atheists, but there is religion which keeps the group together, which is one of the main functions of a religion. It's to make people who seemingly have nothing in common act together towards a common goal. Bubble B is woke, and wokeness is a religion. If you want to learn more about how and why this religion started, I recommend reading The Origins of Wokeness by Paul Graham. But apart from other characteristics which make wokeness a religion, woke people even have their own icons. DEI, globalization, climate change, Zelensky. I think it's safe to say that Zelensky has become a living god for bubble B. I'm not defending Putin at all. I think what he has done is horrible. The problem is that bubble B sees no difference between defending Putin and questioning Zelensky, which makes sense. No religion wants to see their god disputed. One of the qualities that made bubble B effective, especially before 2024, is how well protected the group is by its own elites, whether it's politicians, business people, journalists, scientists, athletes, artists, and others who are often themselves part of the group. These individuals act as the guards of bubble B's Shawshank and make sure that no unwanted people or ideas get in. Even though there definitely are people who only pretend to be part of the group to push forward their initiatives, like military-industrial complex or illegal immigration, but I think that most people most of the guards of bubble B are themselves part of the group. You can imagine bubble B as a prison run by its prisoners. somewhat ironically, this overprotection that originally made Bumblebee very effective is now screwing the group. In addition to powerful self-defense, Bumblebee is also very well unified across the world. Bubble A, as I described it, is mainly relevant in the regions that historically have been under the Russian or Soviet influence, so Central, Eastern, Southern Europe, Central Asia, etc. But Bubble B is the same everywhere. This is partly caused by how people in Bubble B get their news. Woke people around the world all get their news and information from the same Western legacy media, because even their local woke media get their information from these same outlets. And these outlets then all get their information from the same woke politicians, business people, scientists, etc. I think this is a bit different in Bubble A. As I said, people in Bubble A they only speak Slovak or Czech, maybe a bit Russian. They don't understand English. Many of them, they don't travel too much. So I think it's a bit different. To give you an example, I think that like far right, or let's not even say not far right. Let's say very conservative Christians in Slovakia are very different and get their news from very different sources than very conservative Christians in the US, for example. But in Bubble B, this is not the case. They around the world, they get their news from the same sources. Just one clarification point. Very conservative Christians in Slovakia are definitely not far right. I would say that they are way more far left. These people kind of suffer from a nostalgic optimism. Many of them nostalgic optimism towards the life in the Soviet Union. So just clarification. That's actually another point that makes I'll again use the example of conservative Christians. This is another thing that makes many conservative Christians in Slovakia different from conservative Christians in the US. I believe, at least based on my understanding and observation, conservative Christians in the US tend to be more to the right side of the political spectrum. I think that in Slovakia, many of them go more to the left. Anyway, back to the Western legacy media. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, a Russian Nobel Prize laureate, author, and a political prisoner who spent years in the Soviet labor camps, raised the issue of Western legacy media almost 50 years ago, and he did it in one of the centers of Western intelligence at Harvard University. Here is what he said in his 1978 commencement speech, which, by the way, is on YouTube. I highly recommend it. So Solzhenitsyn said, "There is yet another surprise for someone coming from the East, where the press is rigorously unified. One gradually discovers a shallow trend of preferences within the Western press as a whole. It is a fashion. There are generally accepted patterns of judgment. There may be common corporate interests, with the sum effect being not competition, but unification. Enormous freedom exists for the press, but not for the readership, because newspapers mostly give enough stress and emphasis to those opinions which do not too openly contradict their own and the general trend. Without any censorship in the West, fashionable trends of thought and ideas are carefully separated from those which are not fashionable. Nothing is forbidden, but what is not fashionable will hardly ever find its way into periodicals or books or be heard in colleges. Legally, your researchers are free, but they are conditioned by the fashion of the day. There is no open violence such as in the East. However, a selection dictated by fashion and the need to match mass standards frequently prevent independent-minded people from giving their contribution to public life. There is a dangerous tendency to flock together and shut off successful development. People at Harvard actually clapped when Solzhenitsyn said that Western media don't give enough emphasis to opinions that contradict their own and the general trend. I wonder if they would clap today. Another trait that has made Bumblebee effective is how uncompromising they are. Once someone throws even the smallest stone at their Shawshank, they usually retaliate hard. One of their favorite revenge tactics, alongside censorship, is using words that trigger not only negative reactions, not only negative emotions, but also violent reactions from the people on the inside. Words like extremist, racist, fascist, Nazi, far-right, conspiracy theorist, etc. And they repeat these words until the people on the inside simply accept them as the truth. What's interesting is that this strategy works even for people who once were Bumblebee's heroes. You've heard about, for example, Elon Musk, right? Wasn't having a Tesla like a religious symbol of being rich and woke all around the world up until last year? Maybe I'm focusing too much on Bumblebee now. I mean, similar things happen in any other bubble, but in the end, it's the woke bubble that tends to present itself as the smart, educated, tolerant, and enlightened group. One of the things that makes Bumblebee different from many other bubbles is how difficult it is to realize that you might be in it. Conservative Christians anywhere in the world spend most of their time with other conservative... I'm using the example of conservative Christians again, but okay, I'll use Muslims this time. Conservative Muslims anywhere in the world spend most of their time with other conservative Muslims. Conservative Christians are the same, and so on. But these people, I think most of them realize that they exist in small homogeneous groups, and they seem to be okay with it. But woke people are convinced they are not in a bubble. This is because Bumblebee's self-defense focuses very smartly on prevention, not cure. Because once you realize that you might be in Bumblebee, you are already on your way out. That's why Bumblebee loves censorship. They don't want you to get any ideas that you might be in their Shawshank. Usually not even realizing that they are themselves in that same Shawshank. Here is an example from my own life. Around 2016 to 2020, one of my favorite YouTubers was this Czech guy. His name is Michal Sopor. He lived in the Czech Republic at the time and... he lived in Los Angeles at the time and made videos about life in the US for people in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. I looked forward to each of his new videos. I supported him on Patreon. And as I said, he was one of my favorite creators for a couple of years until all of a sudden he became a conspiracy theorist. At least that's what I thought then. Even worse than being a conspiracy theorist, I felt like he started becoming pro-Trump. He questioned the Black Lives Matter protests, talked about the 2020 presidential elections, and said stuff which, in my mind, could not have been true. And I went from supporting this guy on Patreon and looking forward to each of his new videos to blocking him on Instagram as if that was going to change something. And I even messaged his American friend on Instagram asking them to talk to him. See, I didn't even have to be censored by Baba B. I censored myself. You see how that's how that self-defense often works in not just in Baba B, in any bubble. See, anyway, at that point I was anti-Trump. I didn't know anything about Trump, but I knew he should not be the president, and I couldn't understand how any reasonable person could vote for him. That's why I was so mad that this YouTuber, I felt like he started becoming pro-Trump. Fast forward a couple of years, I've found myself on the other side, defending Trump and Elon in arguments with my friends and colleagues. Looking back, I don't think I was ever anti-Trump himself. Again, I didn't know much about him. I think I was more anti the Trump persona that was created and spread in Baba B. But this transition took multiple years, of course. And if someone told me in 2020 that I was the one in the bubble, well, I would think they were an idiot. There was no way I was the one in the bubble. In the end, I read what I thought was the objective international news. I was the one who traveled, studied at the university in the UK, had friends from all over. There was no way I could have been the one in the bubble. But you see, that's how it works. That's why Bubble B is it's dangerous to be in Bubble B, because it's so hard to realize, as I said, that you might be in it, because many people in the woke bubble, they think that they are not in a bubble because they travel, they speak English, etc. And the transition is usually, once you start questioning the bubble, it's very fast, but just that moment to realize that you might be in it. For me it took couple, maybe, I guess the transition started last year, maybe with Elon buying Twitter, now X. That I think really helped me, so I'm really thankful to Elon for this. So what does all this have to do with the collapse of the European Union? A lot, because I believe that the psychological forces that keep us in these bubbles and make it so difficult to realize that we might be in one of them, they are so powerful that if a certain tipping point is reached, it can lead to such an extreme outcome, like the collapse of a world superpower. In 1995, Charlie Munger gave a lecture at Harvard Law School on what he called the Lollapalooza effect. The Lollapalooza effect describes situations where multiple psychological biases, tendencies, or forces work together in the same direction, often creating extreme outcomes. In the lecture, Munger introduces 24 biases. I'm not going to describe all of them. The lecture is on YouTube under the title The Psychology of Human Misjudgment by Charlie Munger. I highly recommend it. It's amazing. Anyway, I would like to mention 5 of these biases. First, man with a hammer syndrome. To a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. This explains why woke people are obsessed about some of their initiatives, such as identity politics or censorship. Even though both are part of the reason why Bumblebee is now losing in many parts of the world, they simply cannot stop pushing them, because to them it's all they see, so they just cannot let it go. To a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Second, consistency and commitment tendency. Munger called this one a psychological superpower, in a negative sense, of course. Here is how he described it.
But what I'm saying here is that the human mind is a lot like the human egg. And the human egg has a shut-off device. When one sperm gets in, it shuts down so the next one can't get in. The human mind has a big tendency of the same sort. And here again, it doesn't just catch ordinary mortals, it catches the deans of physics. According to Max Planck, the really innovative, important new physics was never really accepted by the old guard. Instead, a new guard came along that was less brain-blocked by its previous conclusions. And if Max Planck's crowd had this consistency and commitment tendency that kept their old conclusions intact in spite of disconfirming evidence, you can imagine what the crowd that you and I are part of behaves like. And of course, if you make a public disclosure of your conclusion, you're pounding it in to your own head. Many of these students that are screaming at us, they aren't convincing us, but they're forming mental chains for themselves, because what they're shouting out, they're pounding in. And I think educational institutions that create a climate where too much of that goes on are, in a fundamental sense, they're irresponsible institutions. It's very important to not put your brain in chains too young by what you shout out.
The third bias I wanted to mention is social proof. Saying what you want, questioning the establishment, going against the crowd, and looking for the truth have never been the easiest ways to live. In fact, still today, you might lose your freedom or life in some countries if you go too far. On top of that, mimicking others, especially those whom we want to be like and want to be liked by, is wired in our brains. Kids repeat everything their parents do and say. That's how they learn. And I think this stays with us to some extent for the rest of our lives. Fourth, psychological denial. When reality is too painful to bear, we distort it until it's bearable. Like when Japan refused to surrender during the Second World War, when it was already clear that they were going to lose. But instead of surrendering, they decided to believe that they would somehow win in the end. And so they kept sending hundreds of thousands of people to die. Their Shawshank was so strong that some Japanese soldiers in isolated areas refused to believe that Japan had surrendered for years, decades in some cases, after the war ended. The most famous case is that of Hiro Onoda. He had stayed in the jungle in the Philippines for 29 years after the war ended. He carried out guerrilla warfare, didn't believe messages from his own family, and in the end they had to fly his former commanding officer to the island where Onoda was staying to formally relieve Onoda of duty. Onoda surrendered in 1974. The final bias, the fifth and final bias I wanted to mention is the over-influence of authorities. In the early 60s, Stanley Milgram conducted an experiment at Yale to research why people followed extreme orders that went against their own moral beliefs. Participants, thinking they had joined a memory study, were ordered to give electric shocks to learners if the learners didn't answer memory questions correctly. Of course, the electric shocks were fake. Learners were actors. Nevertheless, the experiment showed that obedience can override personal ethics under the pressure from authority. In The Perils of Obedience, Milgram wrote, quote, "The legal and philosophic aspects of obedience are of enormous import, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and, with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study and the fact most urgently demanding explanation." Also Milgram, in the same article, "Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority." Now imagine that these 5 and at least 19 other biases work together to distort our judgment. To link this to the collapse of the European Union, externally, the European Union is now being attacked from multiple sides, even if the attacks are not physical but psychological, like being ghosted in the Russia-Ukraine war negotiations, or economic, like Trump's retaliatory tariffs. However, if the European collapses, I think the collapse will be mostly internal and caused primarily by the woke bubble. Because Bubble A has always been against the European Union by default, and this is not going to change. The problem is that for the past couple of years, and especially the past couple of months, Bubble B has been pushing to the other side people who were pro-EU and voted for Bubble B candidates until very recently. Bubble B is now making the world anti-woke at an incredible rate. Of course, there are countries, even in Slovakia, I would say that bubble B is maybe still growing, but I think the trend, I think they have reached their peak. And if we look at the woke bubble from the global perspective, the decline that started in the US, I think this will come to Slovakia in a couple of years as well. And I think overall, from a global perspective, bubble B is making the world anti-woke at an incredible rate. The problem is, if you want to keep the European Union going, and if you want to keep the European Union one of the most powerful states or institutions, superstates in the world, you need these people on your side. The European Union is controlled mostly by the woke bubble, but you need these people. They don't need you, but you need them. So, if you want to keep the EU at the level it has been, so can the European Union avoid its collapse? I'm not sure. I think that individual countries that are or were in the European Union can avoid their own collapse. I believe that the United Kingdom can do it, Italy, Germany as well. By the way, I think that Germany might leave the European Union over the next 20 years, let's say. But as a collective, I think that the European Union will go down. What going down might look like, I don't know. Maybe the European Union will split into two factions like the Roman Empire in 395 AD, I think. If the European Union splits into two factions, I think it will be because countries will not be able to find a common ground on which superpower which superpower they want to be under the control of. I think one faction will want to go with the United States and potentially Russia, and the other with China. I think that Trump's victory last November has, if not started, at least really accelerated this process. One of the most popular politicians in Slovakia, his name is Ivan Korčok, he got almost 47% of votes, including mine, in the last presidential elections in 2024. He said in an interview a couple of weeks ago that if Trump doesn't change his approach towards the European Union, then the European Union should collaborate more with China.
To má obrovské politické dôsledky aj v tom, lebo my, Európania, si budeme musieť naliať čistého vína. No tak ak takýmto spôsobom bude prezident Trump pristupovať k nám, ja si myslím, že my musíme prehodnotiť aj našu politiku voči Číne. Teda voči tej Číne, ktorú prezident Trump považuje za najväčšiu...
Znamená čo, že by sme mali s ňou viac spolupracovať?
Áno, ja to chcem otvorene povedať. Že proste z hrušky dole. Ak teda prezident Trump si myslí, že ustojí ten veľký zápas s Čínou ekonomicky, keď bude viesť vojnu s Európou, no tak sa hlboko mýli. A tu ja som na prvom mieste Európan a budem hovoriť celkom otvorene o tom, že pri všetkých výhradách voči Číne, porušovaniu princípov WTO, vieme, akým spôsobom narastla Čína, vieme, že to nie je demokratický režim. No tak, ale keď prezident Trump nanovo kreslí takúto tú mapu sveta, no tak my sa budeme musieť Európania takisto zariadiť. Udeje sa opak toho, čo si prezident Trump želá, to znamená, aby sme ustáli konkurenciu, teda on, Spojené štáty, ale aj my s Čínou.
Also in the same interview, he says that China stands behind Russia, and this guy, of course, is very anti-Putin. So I guess his strategy for making the European Union stronger while making Russia weaker is through a partnership with China. Not surprisingly, Bubble Bee and their media have not made a big deal out of this. Isn't Bubble Bee supposed to be pro-free press and pro-democracy? Also, when the current Slovak Prime Minister, Robert Fico, went to China just a couple of months prior, some people said that it was a threat to the security of Slovakia. I'm not defending him. I don't support this guy at all. But how come when our candidate openly calls for a partnership with China in an interview, we don't say anything? And I think it's stuff like this that is ruining the European Union. Instead of trying to find a way to work with Trump, we go to China, and we even though this partnership, I have to say, actually considering how much Bumblebee loves censorship, this partnership would actually make a lot of sense, maybe even more than with the United States. Maybe China can teach the European Union how to censor others effectively. That's why I think that the European Union might split into two factions, because some countries that anyway, so even though the United Kingdom is not anymore, it left the European Union a couple of years ago, but it's from like the European perspective, I think there are countries which let's say would still prefer the American way, so that's why they will want to align with the United States. I think Germany will be similar, maybe Italy, Poland, and of course other countries. But I think there are like many people, they would maybe even rather be partnered with China, and I think that would completely ruin the European Union. I hope it's not going to happen, but as I said, I think it's exactly stuff like this that is ruining the European Union. I started this video by quoting Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady who for 11 years led one of the most influential countries in history. I want to finish by going back a little. Between 27 BCE and 9 BCE, Roman historian Titus Livius put together a 142-book history of ancient Rome, covering the events from Rome's mythical founding in 753 BCE until the death of Drusus the Elder, Roman politician and military commander, in 9 BCE. The work covers a period of 744 years, a period full of victories, new discoveries and expansion, but also disasters, internal conflicts, political changes, and cultural shifts. Livius named the work Ab Urbe Condita in English, from the founding of the city. Throughout his life and in his studies of Rome's history, Livius had observed a sharp decline in the very things that he believed made Rome greater than any other civilization before it. And so, moved by the admiration for Rome's great past on one side and the disappointment with its state at the time on the other, Livius wrote, "The study of history is the best medicine for a sick mind. For in history you have a record of the infinite variety of human experience plainly set out for all to see. And in that record you can find for yourself and your country both examples and warnings, fine things to take as models, base things rotten through and through to avoid." Also Livius, in the same book, "I invite the reader's attention to the much more serious consideration of the kind of lives our ancestors lived, of who were the men and what the means in both politics and war by which Rome's power was first acquired and subsequently expand it. I would then have him trace the process of our moral decline, to watch first the sinking of the foundations of morality as the old teaching was allowed to lapse, then the rapidly increasing disintegration, then the final collapse of the whole edifice, and the dark dawning of our modern day, when we can neither endure our vices nor face the remedies needed to cure them. Thank you very much for your patience with my thoughts and for watching this video. Again, this is based on my observation and my learning. If you are wondering, yes, I did have a script. Apologies for that. I wanted to present my thoughts as clearly as I could. So thank you very much. Let me know what you think. Let me know what I'm wrong about. And I'll see you next time.